Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. This is Season 8, Episode 23. Today, my guest is James T. Bartlett, who is a journalist and writer who has written for the Los Angeles Times, the BBC, the ALTA California, Hemispheres, Westways, Atlas Obscura, Crime Reads, Real Crimes, and others. James is the author of the books Gourmet Ghosts 1 and 2, which are guides to the history, crimes, and ghost stories of LA's oldest bars, restaurants, and hotels. His latest book, The Alaskan Blonde, Sex Secrets and the Hollywood Story That Shocked America, is out recently this year and is available through all better bookstores. I'm going to now take you to my conversation with author James Bartlett. I always say that having great guests makes it easy for me, and in this case with James, it really is true. I could have talked to him all day, and we did end up talking quite a bit after the episode. I'll take you to this episode right now. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. Today, I'm talking with author James Bartlett, who's written Gourmet Ghosts, both 1 and 2. James, welcome to the podcast. You're originally from Britain. What brought you to America?
Well, it's a bit of a cliche story, I guess, but it was actually for love in the end. The reason I came over here, because if you told me that I'd be living in Los Angeles, I would have said, why on earth would I be ever living there? But I was living for about 5 years. I lived in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And I was trying to do a bit of screenwriting at the time. And I managed to squeeze my way onto a residential course for a week where they brought a number of screenwriters and producers from across the world to a hotel, this little hotel on the coast. And one of the people who came was this American adjunct professor from UCLA, Wendell Thomas. And I didn't speak to her at all during the week because it was lectures all day during the days, and we had separate teams. And then on the last night, there was a last night dinner, and I was planning to sit with all the people that I knew, all the people from locally. And I was late for the dinner, and every seat was taken, which was my own fault, of course. And so the only seat I could see left was next to her. And I thought, well, she seemed really nice. She seemed nice in the lecture. She seemed like a good person. She seemed fun, even though she's American. And I sat next to her, and that was it. And we just got on like a house on fire. And so, she teaches at UCLA, and she's lived in LA. She's from North Carolina originally, but she's been here for like 35 years. So she had a proper job, as I call it, where I'm just freelance as a journalist. So I ended up coming over here in like 2004, and we've been married, ever since.
What did you think of Los Angeles when you first got there? You're from a big city yourself in London, but what did you think of Los Angeles when you got here originally? What was your first take?
Well, I think it's like everybody else thinks when they first came here. I was completely overwhelmed by all of it. The size of it, the traffic, the noise.
Oh yeah.
So many people. It was a big change finding, that everybody drives everywhere to do everything. I still don't have a car here. I've got my test. I've always been a driver, but I've never brought a car here because as soon as I got here, having come from London, I was like, okay, I'm going to find out what the bus service is like and what the subway is like and so forth. And now it's not great, and there's a lot of problems with it, but it does exist. And
yeah.
We happen to live somewhere where we are on a couple of good lines, and it's not inconceivable. But I did find out that for people who've lived here forever, or even who just arrived, the idea of using public transport is inconceivable. But it just doesn't cross people's mind at all. So that was something that took a lot of adjustment. And also, as you say, finding out about the traffic and stuff, how it really is true that someone who lives 10 miles away, I might never go over to where they live because it's just such a hassle to get there. And they might never come to where I live. You often meet halfway, or you'll meet somewhere that's the big center of something because it's just such a drag to get there. But then it's also extremely cool. It's a very positive place. Everyone is here pretty much to try and make something of themselves. So everyone's extremely positive. And thank goodness I'm not an actor, because that seems to be something that unless you're absolutely blinded with passion for it, it's going to be a really tough time. So you meet all sorts of people and mainly from other places than here, which was interesting. And also it was interesting to find that LA does have history because of course I came thinking that, LA is Hollywood, and there really isn't anything else other than, perhaps going back to the beginning of the movies, maybe, but then wasn't it all fields? And that's all you really think of. You don't really realize that, LA is enormous and diverse, and there's a really interesting history here, but we don't see that in movies a lot of the time because, that's not what we're meant to see. That's what documentaries and travelogues are for.
You have written for various publications. Where did writing begin for you, and when did you realize that this would be your career?
I guess I don't really know, but I think possibly it may have had something to do, looking back now that I'm older, with the fact that maybe my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, who actually died before I was born, was a journalist in England. He wrote for the Express and he had a column and he was quite well regarded, as I understand, at the time. And so I've seen some of his clips and stuff, and he was talked about a bit when I was younger. So maybe that had something to do with it. But also, I just think mainly I'm just kind of maybe a bit of a curious person, or maybe I'm too friendly. But I like talking to people and I like finding out things. And if something interests me or something confuses me, or I don't know how something works, or someone has an interesting job, I always end up asking 10 questions about it. And I think that sort of leads you possibly into a way of writing or journalism in some way, certainly non-fictional. Anyway, one where you're dealing with people, and it's certainly afforded me the chance to go to places and meet people I probably wouldn't have normally ever met, just because I figure if you don't ask, you don't get, and you sort of go through life and, you try and learn things, even if they're the most trivial, unusual things. And that's kind of what I like doing. And I guess journalism or writing is kind of how that makes you sort of end up somewhere.
Now, in 2012, you wrote the first of your two Gourmet Ghosts books. Can you tell us where the nucleus of these books came from and how the idea came to you?
Yeah, I mean, it was partly to do with having moved to LA and trying to sort of get a grip of the place. I mean, it was a few years after I'd been here, of course, and I had been working locally, but I was starting to sort of go out a bit more, and I was trying a lot of happy hours. And, as I would always sit at the bar and talk to the bartender, because that was also a good way to get to know people and to get to know any stories. And since I especially liked the older bars, the ones that I thought might have stories, I would sit in there, and eventually the bartender, or sometimes the bouncer or the security guard, if it was a hotel, something like that, you could end up talking to them and just chatting away. And they would end up maybe telling you stories. Sometimes they'd be the celebrity stories, because it's in Los Angeles. But sometimes they would tell ghost stories or unusual stories. And I got told one, and somebody suggested it to me or mentioned it to me. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That could make an article, perhaps. But what I decided was I was going to look them up in the newspaper archives first to see if the story I was told had any relation to anything that ever happened at that bar or at that hotel. Because otherwise, you could just be making it up. And I found out that, lo and behold, most of the stories I got told had some basis in truth, or at least in a basis of something that actually happened in the past, usually a long time ago. And it just went from there. People, once they found I was interested in that, they said, oh, you should look up here, or you should go to this bar because that's really old. And I've heard this story and I've heard that story. And it just went on and on and on. And suddenly I had collected all these stories and these newspaper articles. And my wife just really said, you should do a guide. This should be a guidebook. And I went to the local bookstores and found that they really didn't have a guidebook like that. There was a restaurant guide, bars, hotels and restaurants, places you could go that had maybe some food and drink recommendations if you're a tourist or a local, but then also had some of their unusual stories, the ghost story or the crime story or a celebrity story. There were lots of sort of celebrity ones, and there were a lot of ghost ones, but the ghost ones always just seemed to be, the story goes, they say that kind of thing. And I just thought, no, I want something from the newspaper that says, goodness me, there was a woman who was murdered in a bedroom here. And, there's a story that a ghost haunts the building because she was murdered here. That's a connection to me. And it made it seem a little more real, as much as a ghost story can be real, and it just really took off from there. I didn't realize that so many people were so interested in I guess, history and ghost stories and crime.
I know that I'm a huge fan of the paranormal, as is my wife, and we watch a lot of documentaries and TV shows on this topic. We've heard a lot about a few places in LA, like the Stan Main Hotel and the Viper Room. What are some of the favorite places that you like to go to that you find to be the most interesting?
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, Stay on Main, as you say, that's famously more known as the Cecil Hotel. Yes, that is an extremely odd place. I've been there two or three times. It's different now. It's low income charity housing now. You can't go in there. It's not a hotel anymore. Um,
Hmm.
but looking through the archives again, that hotel had way more suicides and murders and criminal activity, and two serial killers stayed there than anywhere else I'd ever come across. I don't know why. I've really looked hard to see if it was built somewhere unusual, built on a churchyard, built somewhere in the worst part of town, whether there was a lot of problems. Nothing like that. It was a very posh, high-end hotel when it was built. So that place, very much so, is one I get asked about a lot, especially after the girl, Elisa Lam, the tourist, died in the water tank about 10
Yeah.
years ago. So I get asked a lot about that. But some of the other ones, again, they all tend to be older places. There's the Formosa Cafe, which is in West Hollywood. That's partly made out of an old Pacific Line steam train, tram. Part of that is the bar, and that used to be a gangster hangout, and that was owned by a guy called Lem Kwan. Actually, it was the anniversary of his death the other day, and his ghost still haunts there. And all the staff told me that when I went in there. They had said, well, I saw something and I described him, and they were describing this guy, of course, who they'd never met. And that's a beautiful bar. And then the Magic Castle, as the name might suggest, obviously
Yeah. Oh,
has
yeah.
some ghosts, real and imaginary. So that's a great fun place to go. It's sort of a museum, performance space, library, and it is a club for magicians. Then there's the Biltmore Hotel, which is in downtown Los Angeles. That's right on Pershing Square. That's coming up for 100 years old. I got quite a few ghost stories from there, and it makes sense because a lot of these hotels, the really old ones, they've had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people go through there over the years, and a few of them, just because of just mathematics alone, will have died of natural causes. A lot of people go to hotels to commit suicide as well, and there's likely to be other crimes as well, just because there's so many people that go there over hundreds, over 100 years. 800 rooms, 100 years. Think how many people went through there.
Oh, yeah.
And then even more the contemporary hotels, like the Bonaventure Hotel in downtown LA. Now that was built in the late 70s and looks a bit like a spaceship. A lot of your listeners have probably seen it in a lot of movies. It's all glass, and they're circular, conical towers. They're like towers, and it looks like a spaceship, or at least a spaceship has landed in the center of downtown. That's only 40 years old. It's very unusually designed, really unusual inside, really such a strange place, is in a lot of movies, but it's had its crimes. It's had crimes too. So that one I particularly like to go and look at because it's so unusual. But any old building, whenever I hear that a building's been repurposed or that a building's reopening, because for a long time downtown was kind of a no-go area and all the buildings were largely abandoned. It wasn't hip like it is now. So whenever they open a new bar, I immediately look up the address in the newspaper archives to see if anything ever happened there. And, if it's 80 years old, chances are something did. And that, is at least there's a crime. And then if I go there and never talk to any people and they tell me a story, if it relates to the crime, I'm like, okay, then that could be a ghost story. I'm not telling you whether to believe or to not believe. There are a lot of documentaries. I did go into when Ghost Adventures went into the Cecil Hotel a couple of years ago. I was on that show,
Yeah.
and it was a fun thing to do, and they're a great bunch, and it was an interesting experience. But the problem with the TV shows is they are edited, and they have to find things because otherwise there's no program.
Right.
If they just walk around and it's completely silent, there's no program. And these are old buildings. There's old plumbing and old piping and old radiators and old everything. So the older hotels, especially, all the elevators, open and close on their own because, it's 100-year-old electrics.
Are there any Are there any hotels or bars that you've been to where you got kind of spooked going there yourself?
I always kind of think it would be the greatest thing in the world for me to not get spooked. And if something happened, then I could do a rational report on what happened.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some, the Cecil Hotel didn't spook me out, but I wasn't massively keen to go exploring when the Ghost Adventures team went exploring because I knew so much had happened there.
Yeah.
So many unhappy things had happened there. And why would you want to walk around like that? I mean,
Right.
it's not like a graveyard. People say, well, I don't like going to a graveyard because all those people are dead. And I'm like, well, it's they didn't get murdered there. That's where they were
Yeah.
laid to rest. But in a hotel or a restaurant, if someone got, murdered in the bedroom and I'm quite prepared to believe that if they had a spirit or something, it might be there. Why would it not? I mean, if you had your life taken away from you, perhaps you'd stay there and hope that eventually someday would find it out or give you maybe the respect you deserve. But no, not anywhere that's creeped me out. But I've definitely spoken to people who've told me stories and they've been quite creepy and have made me think, wow, I can tell you really believe that. And that must have been extremely unsettling for you.
You've written a lot about LA, and I could tell from your writing that you have a real passion for it. What is it about LA that captivates you and keeps you there?
That's a good question. I mean, I think like most people here, sometimes I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it here. But I think just because I think the thing that's most intrigued me as time has gone on is that everyone thinks it's very modern and, a disposable, temporary, fake city, but it's not. There's so much interesting history and so much interesting architecture. And, I'm from London, obviously, or close to London. Of course, London has more history than that. It's not like, LA goes deep back into the past, but I think it's a city that nobody thinks there's anything like that at all. So when you do find anything, everyone's always interested. I think it's something like that. I think I talk to people about the books or I mention what I'm interested in. People here are just like, really? I had no idea. They just think, that the city's 50 years old. They think it started with the movies and it was pretty much all glamour from then on. And of course, that isn't the case for any city of any kind with any industry.
What are some of the bars and restaurants that outside of your writing you just love to go to? They put a smile on your face whenever you go there.
It's it tends to be most of the ones that I do like that I mention in the books. I mean, I do like going to El Coyote a lot. I mean, a lot of people will know that that's a Mexican restaurant where Sharon Polinsky or Sharon Tate and her friends had their meal before they were horribly murdered back in 68 or 69. That was their last meal, and people go there every year and book her table to sit at that table. Now that doesn't really interest me so much, but we went to that restaurant dozens and dozens and dozens of times. It's very close to the house. There have been some other ones, a lot of downtown places. I mean, it changed a lot with COVID, because a lot of them closed for a long time. Some of them didn't come back. So there are still some there, but I'm always interested in trying newer places, but I do like the old places. Like the Grand Central Market is always great to walk through. I mean, that's a market, but I like the Farmers Market here, which is at Fairfax and Third. Now that's 95 years old. That's coming up for 100 years. But that's an outdoor, farmers marketplace. I don't always look up restaurants straight away before I go to them. I do try new ones, and anyone that's new and anything that's local, I'll give a try to. If it has a happy hour, I'm in.
LA has some very distinct landmarks that many writers write about. I know that when I read Michael Connelly, he writes a lot about some distinct places, and I feel like I almost know LA from his writings. But there's some places like Mulholland Drive, the La Brea Tar Pits. Do you have any wonderful landmarks that are your favorite parts of LA?
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that I think are especially unusual and that most people don't get to see. Like the Hollywood Bowl has a museum, which most people don't know.
Oh,
Yes,
I did not
exactly.
know that.
No, that's the thing. I mean, when you walk up what they call Pepper Tree Lane, which everybody has to walk up to get to the Hollywood Bowl, but before you give your tickets. Just on the left, there's a museum. I think it's because it faces out, and so you don't see any sign because you're walking past it. But that's a really little interesting museum, and it's one of those places that you think I'd never go unless I was at the bowl. But that's an interesting museum. I nearly always go on Angel's Flight when I go downtown. That's a little funicular railway that Michael Connolly actually wrote set a couple of his murders on Angel's Flight. It's a little, it's just a little orange funicular railway. It goes up and down. There's two of them on a counterbalance. It's about a 30-degree gradient, and it goes up and down 1 minute each way. Every time I go downtown, I always go on that, usually just up and down, just because when do you ever get to do that? You don't ever get to do that. I'm really hoping that the Bonaventure Hotel reopens its rotating lounge, which it had. Not many of those left in the world. And they had one which we used to go to quite a lot because it has an amazing view. And of course, they closed for COVID. But I've actually seen some of the workings on the inside of the rotating lounge and how it works. And it is not Harry Potter-esque, which is what I thought it would be. I thought it would be all work, and it's just really like a big circle of metal and these little wheels that just roll around on it. It was really quite sparse. And I said, well, how do you stop it and start it? And they say, oh, we just press stop and we just press start. There's nothing special about it. It doesn't roll on its own. It doesn't have a life of its own. It's just like a piece of electronics. You switch it on, you switch it off.
This episode is sponsored by Culinary Historians of Northern California, a Bay Area educational group dedicated to the study of food, drink, and culture in human history. To learn more about this organization and their work, please visit their website at www.chnorcal.org. Alaskan Blonde came out this year. It's your newest book. Where did you first hear about the Wells murder case, and why did you want to write about it?
That was, it was lucky. It was actually one of the things I covered in my second book, in Gourmet Ghosts 2, which was a lot more crime focused. And I had found there's a famous hotel in Hollywood, or it was a famous hotel called the Hollywood Plaza Hotel. It's on Hollywood and Vine, just a little, like a few steps down at Hollywood and Vine. And I looked it up because it was a famous hotel, and I couldn't include it in the book unless it had a restaurant or bar now. It's not good enough to put something in, because the whole point to me is that a guide has to be to places you can go. Otherwise, you're just looking outside, looking in. And it did have a little like chocolate coffee shop underneath, which was a bit of a cheat, but I looked up the history and it had a couple of suicides and it had some crime, but it also had this Alaskan murder case. Which was that the murder of Cecil Wells in Fairbanks, Alaska in 1953. And it was connected because his wife, Diane Wells, came down to LA when she made bail. She was charged with the murder alongside her lover, Johnny Warren. And she came down to LA for about 4 or 5 months before the trial. And without giving any spoilers away, that hotel ended up playing a part in the story. And I read the newspaper report about it and I thought, gosh, what a story. I must read the book about that. And there hadn't been a book about it. And I thought, well, this is the 50s. They must have made like a bad B movie or something, because it was a total film noir style story. Her husband was a rich millionaire. Her lover was like a black musician. You couldn't have made it more film noir. And I didn't really find anything online about it at all, even any pictures. And I was just curious. And I just thought, I wonder what happened to these people, what happened to the children that these various people had. And that just led me down a complete rabbit hole of trying to contact the children, who of course were all grown now. I mean, they were children at the time. Some family members, just really to find out what happened. And when I spoke to them and found them, they all said to me, well, we don't know. We were children. No one ever talked to us about it. It's just like a black hole in our history. And that made me even more intrigued to do it. And so like I think I mentioned, I ended up going up to Fairbanks and doing some research there. And I'd just been to Fairbanks back in October. Now the book's finally done. to go up there. And I met people then who, were around at the time and were adults at the time, and they were still telling me stuff about it. So it came out of that book. It's in the book. I put it in the second Gourmet Ghost book because I never for a second thought, gosh, this is going to lead into its own book. But that's kind of the beauty of some of the very old stories. They're so unusual and so removed from what we know today. You can sort of attach them and you think, what happened? What happened to those people? There was a moment they were in the newspapers, but what happened to them the rest of their lives?
As a journalist, you do a lot of research. And as a librarian, I'm very fascinated with what you do. So much of what you talk about makes me think of you almost as a private eye. What kind of detective work do you do, or what kind of work? Describe your research process for these books and stories?
Well, it's lucky, thank goodness. Obviously, the internet is
Yeah.
that's the first thing you can say. There are so many websites available from Google right along to be able to look up a lot of stuff. And Facebook's really useful to get in touch with people. But a lot of it is, like you say, it's in terms of being quite a private eye. It's also about your approach and your tone. When I was getting in touch with people for the Alaskan Blonde, most of them, quite understandably, initially were like, "What the hell? Why the hell do you care? What's this got to do with you? Why are you interested in this?" It was 70 years ago. Some of them thought I was a lawyer looking for something, or some of them thought I was looking to do some sort of salacious tell-all. But usually, if you just listen rather than talk to them, I would talk to the family members, and if you listen rather than talk, they'll tell you. Usually, there was only one or two people who really didn't want to talk about it. Everyone I talked to wanted to talk about it because they all said, we never knew what happened. We would like to know what you find out. Which put a bit of the onus on me to try and be, as even-handed as possible. And, when I finished the book, I knew there would be things in there that certain people, family members, would be upset to read, or wouldn't believe, or wouldn't think were true. Because, why would you think that, your mother was a murderer? Why would you ever believe that, for example? But because it was nonfiction, and because I'd spoken to these people and, I wasn't making anything up, I could sort of present it in a way that I thought, look, here are all the facts that I could find. Here at the end of the book is what I think happened on the night in question. And most of the people that I spoke to, or who were kind enough to get in touch, said, that all kind of makes sense. It makes sense. I really appreciate you for doing this. It really helped. It answered a lot of questions. And, that was gratifying, because a lot of these people in their 70s and 80s, and they hadn't really known what happened in that part of their life for 50 or 60 years. So, I mean, does that answer your question, or did I get a little bit off the point there?
No, that's perfect.
Oh, but being a private eye. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. But thank goodness for the internet. Thank goodness for the internet. But it is all about an approach. Even when I was doing the Gourmet Ghost books, I wouldn't go into a bar, sit down at the bar and say, "So are there any ghost stories here?" Because then they feel kind of obliged to tell you one, because,
Right.
because it's fun, and they want to chat to you, so you don't ask that. Usually it's less is more. If you just show an interest and come across as a genuinely interested person, usually people will talk and say, "Oh, there's this and this has happened," and and then there's a strange story that everyone here knows, and I go, "Oh, what's that?" And then they would tell you the story, and I would remember it, or I'd write it down, and then I'd go back and look it up. And a lot of the time I'd go back and say, "You know what? That story you told me, that stuff happened. Something like that did happen there." And usually they're like, "Well, we thought so. We imagined that something had happened." So the internet's absolutely imperative. But I'm of an age where and I think I could still manage if I did that now, but it would just take a lot longer. I think these days we'd have to write a letter. But I also did that when I was doing the Alaskan Blonde. I wrote letters to people as well, because you can sometimes find their address, or what you think is their address. And definitely, if you handwrite a letter, people realize that you're actually taking time over it. It's not some weird thing that you found on the internet, or you just found a scandalous story that you thought you'd find out what happened. I'd imagine there's a lot of that. But, thank goodness for the archives. I mean, archives and librarians and researchers, none of anything I would ever do would ever exist without any of them.
There's enough material in Gourmet Ghost 1 and 2 easily to do several seasons of a television show. Has anybody ever approached you about something like that?
It has been mentioned a few times. Yes. I mean, there's someone who said that they're interested in doing it at the moment. I mean, the thing is, I'm quite happy for people to do that because pretty much everything that's in the books, it's all public, public material. I haven't made anything up. It's not fiction. It'd be nice to be involved. It'd be nice to front it, because I've done some talks and I've done some lectures, and there's always been talk every now and then of a walking tour, perhaps downtown, where I take people to a few places and tell them the stories. And that would be great. I think that anyone that's interested in history and, wants to learn a little bit about where they live, I'm all into that because that's what I want to do.
So I wanted to ask you what's next for you?
It's funny. The last few months, all people have been asking me like, which crime are you doing next? Here's a murder we heard about in our town. I got quite a few of those people telling me stories from when they were young, something that happened to a friend of theirs or a neighbor or sometimes a family member, and it was never solved, or they never really knew what happened, which was nice of people to offer that, to think that, I could help them with that in a way. I'm going to put together like a third sort of Gourmet Ghost book. It's going to be sort of called Gourmet Crimes, I think, because it's going to be sort of a revised and updated with some new material, sort of version of the first two. But there is another murder actually in Fairbanks, believe it or not, which somebody told me about when I was up there, that happened in the same building where the murder I wrote the book about happened, believe it or not. But they told me that story and I was like, that sounds a little unusual. I wonder what happened there. So I looked in the newspaper archives, as I always do first, because if there really isn't anything in the newspaper archives, it's going to be harder. It's going to be harder to find stuff, especially from long ago. But I looked in the newspaper archives. There wasn't a lot, but as I should have mentioned before, you can make freedom of information requests to the FBI, and you can make requests to local police forces and so forth. I mean, you have to find the right website and you have to have the correct information to reply. But this particular one, I made a couple of requests and they've asked for 2 payments for research. So they've obviously found something. What the documents say, I've no idea. And, it's going to have to be something that makes me, suspicious and makes me think, well, that doesn't sound right. It sounds like a suspicious death. It happened in the 70s. So there are still people around who were, alive at the time, obviously. So that could be a little trickier and talking to them. But if that comes through, I'll have a go at that. There's also a guy who was involved in the Cecil Wells murder case, who was one of the law enforcement guys. I got to know his children. I say children, they're fully grown adults now, grandparents. But I got to know them quite well. And he had a private journal that he wrote of his career. And I put some pages of it in the book because they gave me some of these pages because he wrote about the Cecil Wells murder case. But he did write other stuff as well about his career. And, just being in sort of the 1940s and 50s in Alaska, which firstly, and secondly, it wasn't a state then either. So him being an important law enforcement, I was thinking what an interesting project that would be. If I could get my hands on all his notes, put them in some sort of order and see if there was a book or research it and find out what kind of career this guy had. Again, it's a book that is only just going to be interesting to people in Alaska. But, this guy was involved in this case and he writing a few stories for like the pulp detective magazines, about some of his bigger cases. And I just thought, well, that sounds interesting, because I guess it's like a lot of writers who do nonfiction, I think. We just love going through archives and doing research. That's the bit that we love the most, I think. When it's nonfiction, it can almost kind of write itself. And if it can't write itself, you probably then you should do fiction. But when it's nonfiction, if it's someone's story or something that really happened, there should be all that source material you can work from. And then you just work backwards and you work sideways and you work forward and you try and just draw an enormous big picture like a big spider web. And then bring it all together and boil it down and go, right, how do I make this interesting to somebody who has no idea about this at all? I have to make it, a narrative. I have to give it a beginning, a middle, and an end. I can't go around individually talking to everybody and go, you'll never guess this story that I found. You have to read this book. You can't do that. It's got to be something that people can latch onto and follow throughout the book. So you end up, never using a huge amount of stuff that you find because it's not relevant to making someone else interested, because they'll never be as interested as you are, because you spent all the time doing all the research. But, so I'm an expert on, one murder in Alaska in the 1950s, which, I don't know if that's something I can take to my grave, but, it's something I definitely know about. And if people talk to me or ask about it, I can go, yes, I know that to be true, or I know that not to be true.
It's funny. I love nonfiction and I read a lot of it. I think the bulk of what I read is nonfiction. And even so often, if you know what's going to happen at the end, because it's history, obviously,
Yeah.
it's still, if somebody writes it well, it's thrilling. Like I remember I read something just this year about the beginning of World War II. And when Britain entered into war with Germany. And of course, I knew it was going to happen, but I was still on the edge of my seat throughout the entire book. And I think that people like you make history exciting.
Well, you have to, because at the end, I try not to give the spoilers away, but, it's a murder case. It's not going to end well, is it? It's not going to end happily. Yeah. No one's going to be happy at the end. So that's fairly a given. But what you try and the interest in the story is, how did all these people end up here? Yeah. How did they all end up being in a room? Or how did one person end up with a gun in their hand? How did that come to pass? Was it an absolute spur of the moment thing, or was it something that was planned? And if it was something that came to pass, can we look at their history and go, you know what, this was going to happen? Or do we look at it and go, that was an absolute moment out of nowhere, but why was it out of nowhere and what happened? Because, it's people said to me, well, the book isn't a great book because, it doesn't go to trial. No one goes to prison. And I said, well, that doesn't mean necessarily that it's not an interesting story, and in this case, someone did go to prison in relation to this murder. It just wasn't anyone they expected. And that's what I found out, and I was talking to people who, were closely connected to the story. And they said, what? We didn't know that. Someone went to prison for it. And I said, oh, yes, served, 60 days, which isn't much. But someone did go to prison in relation to this crime. Nobody had any idea about that. So, it's just all the factors that are involved in a story. World War II is, okay, so England and the Americans, the Allies beat the Germans and the Japanese. That's how you could sum it up after 5 years, and many millions of people got. And it's like, well, you've got to give me more than that. You can't just tell me that's what happened. How did that get to be? Who did this? What happened? What were the important things that led to the moment, let's say, when, a surrender was signed? What led to that moment? Who signed that surrender? And did they really feel they needed to sign it? And what was their reason behind it? Did they feel they had no choice? Or did they do it because they felt it was the right thing? You're guessing to an extent, but if you provide enough facts, and again, this is why nonfiction is great. If you provide enough facts, the reader, hopefully, if you've presented them in that way, will get to a stage where they're like, I get it. I can see why that happened. And then you have a greater understanding.
James, I've had a great time talking to you today. I want to thank you for being on the podcast. I hope you get to come on again sometime.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd be happy to.
That was my conversation with James Bartlett. His newest book, The Alaskan Blonde, is out now. You can get it at all better bookstores. We also have links to buy it online in the bio. Tomorrow we'll be talking with Allison Walsh of the literary-themed cooking blog Wonderland Recipes. You can help us promote this podcast by sharing this on social media. You can share on social and tag us at Well Librarian. Follow the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast on Spotify, and you'll be notified when new episodes come each week. As you do your holiday shopping this season, remember that cookbooks and all books make the best gifts. If you buy them from the local bookstore, you'll be doing doubly good. I hope all of you are cooking up some great things, and we'll be talking with you tomorrow.